Hello and welcome to today's Procurement Officers webinar. I am your moderator Subro Sen. Thank you for joining us. Today's topic is digital transformation in procurement. Does analytics really lead to better procurement performance? Our expert speakers will be addressing few of the burning questions around the topic which we received from you or your procurement peers. In addition to these questions, if you have any other questions, you can submit it using the Q&A widget on the right-hand side of your screen, and our expert speakers will answer them at the end of the session. Before we begin, let me first introduce you to our speakers. Kelly Berner owns and manages Buyer's Meeting Point, which is a trusted source of information for procurement practitioners and solution providers alike. Kelly has a unique perspective on procurement from the numerous roles she has held during her 15 years in procurement. For the last 7 years, she has covered procurement news, events, publications, solution trends, and relevant economics at a Buyer's Meeting Point. She has several regular columns throughout the industry, and in the summer of 2016, she was appointed to become the Business Survey Chair for the ISM New York Report on Business. She has co-authored 3 books: Supply Market Intelligence for Procurement Professionals, Research, Process, and Resources, which was published in 2014, Procurement at a Crossroads, Career Impacting Insights into a Rapidly Changing Industry, which was published in 2016, and Finance Unleashed, Leveraging the CFO for Innovation, published in 2017. We also have Phil Dungy as our keynote speaker. He has recently joined IACCM to head up the new advisory service line. He comes to IACCM from KPMG, where he headed up the business transformation group for central government clients in the UK. Prior to KPMG, he was a partner in charge of government consulting at Atos and gained his experience with 14 years at PwC. Phil has gained extensive experience in private and public sector in the UK, Hong Kong, and Japan, and has extensive experience as the buy-side strategic advisor on a number of large-scale procurement organizations. He has also been the solution architect on the sell side during his time at Atos. Phil is an assessor at the UK's Government Commercial Function Assessment and Development Center, and he has developed a highly regarded program to upskill non-commercial senior contract owners and senior civil servants. We also have John Hansen as our expert speaker for today's webinar. As the editor and lead writer for the Procurement Insights blog, John Hansen has written nearly 3,000 articles and papers, as well as 5 books on subjects as diverse as supply chain practice, public sector policy, emerging business trends, and social media. In addition to being a much sought-after speaker and a moderator internationally, John is also the host of the highly acclaimed PI Window on the World Show on Blog Talk Radio, which has aired more than 800 episodes. A 2-time Ottawa finalist for the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award out of a group of 15,000, Blog Talk Radio named John Hansen as one of their top 300 hosts. With that, I now turn over to John to begin the webinar.
Question, and I think I can get it there. Come on. There. Question 1. And I'll start off with you, Kelly, and then go to Phil. One person asked, how are analytics applied to procurement? That seems like a general question overall, one of those catch-all nets, but what would you say if somebody asked you that, Kelly, which I am?
So what I would actually say, step 1 to being able to answer the question is differentiating between analysis and analytics, right? So analysis, just the straightforward tactical data manipulation, right, maybe some quality assurance. But I think the fact that we're talking about analytics here, it implies that there's a greater level of strategy going on. It's the business drivers, it's the goals and objectives behind the analysis that we're performing. And unfortunately, to date, an awful lot of the drivers behind the analysis that we've done have been around kind of an 80-20 Pareto kind of approach, saying we just want to bring as much of it as we can under management as fast as possible and drive reasonable savings. But it's not terribly complex, it's not very nuanced, and it's not really contextualized enough to address things like risk, like optimization, taking into consideration suppliers that are very small but are incredibly strategic to the business. So I think at this point, it's really about procurement applying analytics by asking increasingly complex questions that extend beyond procurement and instead move a little bit closer to shareholder value, to customer success, to competitive advantage, anything that it can improve the influence of the company in the larger market space that they play in.
All right, now I have to go to this because I'm making a couple notes here to add some additional thoughts there. But Phil, I want to get to you right away, and your perspective is certainly coming at it from a different angle than, let's say, the procurement side of things. You heard what Kelly had to say. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, from an association with 16,000 members, we have experience of them doing it in totally different ways. So I agree with the difference between analysis and the analytics there, and suggest that it's almost the tyranny of Microsoft. And what I mean by that is everybody has Word, so contracts are written in Word, and everyone has Excel, so they do their analysis using Excel. And actually, are they the best tools? We suggest not. But also, analytics applied to procurement, as it stands, it's generally around the savings, and you see that through the flavour of the questions throughout this pack. It's, you know, the savings, the financials, etc. What we have is a much broader context that procurement needs to sit in. It is a step within a trading relationship, and as such, what we should be looking at is how do we apply analytics across that value chain? How do we create the shareholder value that Kelly's talking about there? And the analytics that are then applied are much broader. They are about that commercial strategy, they're about that operational strategy, and then they're about the how do you get to a frictionless delivery of that contract that procurement set up. So that's where we should be. Where are we seeing it? It's only tentatively stepping along that process at the moment.
Well, you see, now there's a couple of thoughts that came into this equation here, because one of the things, and I just did an earlier webinar on the postmodern ERP era, and one of the biggest challenges that procurement had with the traditional ERP systems is the timeliness or of getting the data and the intelligence. In other words, when they want to extract information out of the older systems, the traditional platforms in the back end, it could sometimes take months before they got the information. By the time they had it, it was outdated. It had a shelf life that was no longer available or relevant to what they wanted to find out. With the advent of new technology, they talk about the fact is that now what it does is it frees people to be able to become more strategic in their thinking. In other words, what you call the more repetitive or mundane tasks, which are being addressed through RPA, robotic process automation, the emergence of all these things, means that they have more time to get that data, extract it out, and understand what it means, and then become more strategic in their thinking. So when I'm listening to the descriptions in terms of this, and Kelly, I'll go back to your analysis versus analytics, I mean, the fact is that today with the newer technology, we get information quicker, and it's more relevant to what we need in the here and now. And thus, we have a new transformation happening where procurement professionals now having that information are moving outside their traditional framework of what's the savings in a post-transaction realm to being able to be strategic in a pre-transaction or a pre-acquisition realm. Do you know what I'm saying, Kelly? Does that make sense?
I do think it makes sense. And I think the thing that's interesting where you talk about the increased pace of access to data, in a way, it's a little bit like calling our bluff. And when I say our, I'm including myself in procurement in this, because for so long we've been able to, or had to, depending on your perspective, say things like, oh, well, we can't do this that quickly because we don't have the real-time data. And so we've put a lot of emphasis on getting access to that information with the promise of being able to create additional value and being more strategic should that become available. Well, the scary reality is that if it's not available to us today, it's effectively going to be at our fingertips tomorrow. And I think that's scary for a lot of procurement teams and also for a lot of the enterprises we support, because now the data is there. So now, in theory, we should be prepared to make decisions, fully informed decisions, much more quickly And I think there's a little bit more of a human holdback aspect to that than maybe we wanted to admit in the past.
Well, see, maybe that goes to what you said, Phil, are we prepared to do analysis? Are we prepared to be strategic from the procurement realm? Because you mentioned something, again, when you said, well, it's just the limited focus on savings. That's very much an after-the-fact assessment of your performance and where did we save money and how can we do better. And it's very much transactional in its orientation. Being strategic, being able to analyze this data, now that we have it, much like what you're saying, Kelly, is that, you know, we no longer have the excuse, well, we don't have the information. We have the information, but Phil, are procurement professionals prepared to step into this world of immediate information and assume the responsibility for being able to not only analyze it, but to become strategic and use it to make better decisions?
Well, it's interesting about the better decisions. I think that the data, before we actually started, we suggested, I was looking through the questions and thought question 10 was a good starting point, and we are sort of covering that question 10 actually around why now. Data is more readily available. The processing power is there. The tools and the techniques are better understood, but actually it comes down to what are the decisions that people are making. The information is there once you've unearthed the data and analyzed it and sorted through, but are we asking the procurement professionals to make the right decisions?
Well, so that's okay. Now that's an interesting point. Maybe that goes to the heart of this question in answering how are analytics applied to procurement. Maybe that's the cry for help to a certain degree. Is okay. We now have this information. We now have everything available at our fingertips. It's like having 300 channels on a satellite dish. How do you decide what to watch, right? You know, I mean, so the whole point is that when they look at the old way of saying what's the best cost savings, what kind of analytics, what kind of information now can they extract from this process to enable them to be able to utilize it better? I mean, that's really a question, Kelly. I mean, like, what information, beyond savings, what can this do for me? And I realize, and I'll put a sort of a caveat on there, if your organization views procurement in the old days, and I was just talking about you this morning, Kelly, in our book, Procurement at Crossroads, where you said people were put into purchasing to be sent away somewhere. You know, goodbye, see you around. I mean, if you have an organization that's still doing that, I'm sure it's still very much cost-centric, but I'm seeing more and more organizations come forward saying, we need more from our procurement department and not just the bottom line savings. What areas does this analytics help to expand beyond that myopic view of what our past role has been?
So I think the big thing is it takes us beyond spend data. Right? I mean, in most cases, when you're talking about doing analysis on spend data, which at the end of the day is going to put you through kind of a volume leveraged approach to get to maximum cost savings, you are just talking about that sort of flat analysis. You're not talking about the more strategic, business objective-driven analytics. Whereas when you're talking about full analytics, now, yes, of course you're going to pull in spend data. You're going to pull in indicators from master data that tell you whether or not someone is strategic. You're going to pull in supplier performance indicators, but you're also going to look outside of the company and pull in external or third-party data enrichment that should be influencing decisions. So you're going to be looking at factors like supply chain risk. You're going to be looking at geopolitical risk factors. You'll be looking at maybe supplier diversity if you have objectives around that, or different kinds of pertinent regulations depending on the industry that you're purchasing in. I think once we start looking at the data and immediately right in front of us, there is more than just a business unit, a spend dollar amount, and a purchase date that really limits what we can do, and it presumes that old volume leveraged approach. Whereas if we start pulling in some of these bigger pictures right into the data set, it is going to change the way we manage the spend because it's going to change the way that we see it.
Got it. All right. Now, we have to move on. Hopefully, we answered that question. If there are any comments about what we had to say, agree, disagree, share them with us. Let's go on to question number 2. And that is, how do I drive additional savings and value across more of my spend using analytics? I mean, isn't this really just really a question of an extension of what we've already talked about, Phil?
It is to a point, and it is a good link from the previous question, because looking there at the sources, what you can bring in, the financial, the regulatory, the performance indicators, you've got your supplier health check aspect, and then you've got your price, quality, availability, which is more of a product and service health check in there. But actually, you know, we've been working with a large organization that has been using analytics to decrease the friction post-contract award. So much value is leaked from ineffective processes post-contract award. And one of them had 80,000 statements of work. And if you can just use the analytics to work out which of those, what's working on those, what's not working on those, you actually get in a big cost saving, and you can quantify that may not be directly attributable to procurement in the first instance, but actually by them procuring it right, using the right statements of work and the terms and conditions, getting all that sort of stuff sorted, you're actually having a massive bottom line impact on the organization as a whole. So it brings us, using analytics in such a way enables greater savings than just the cost saving of a particular product or service that you're purchasing. It's how do you actually undertake the management of that through the value, the life cycle of that contract, of that product or service, to such an extent that you're decreasing the costs attributed to that, maybe in operations, maybe in finance, maybe elsewhere, but using the analytics, you can start valuing that up. So are you doing the right things up front in order to get the value out the back end, both of the contract, but also decrease the cost of servicing that contract?
All right, now I have to ask this, Kelly, and again, coming from a procurement background, and what Phil had to say, is there this kind of extended insight or foresight, whatever would be the most applicable, in terms of seeing it beyond the savings that we've traditionally looked at? Do you know what I mean by that?
I do, and I think it actually comes back to the very last point that Phil made, where he said, are we doing the right things up front to get the full desired value once we're done? And I know it's hard in a webinar, but let me try to give everybody a little bit of a visual that makes my point. If you think about the traditional strategic sourcing process, which is what most companies are using to manage the majority of their spend, it doesn't matter if it's 5 steps or 7 steps or 8 steps or 12, whatever it is. It's always this forward marching process flow with chevrons across the top and supporting step-level bullets underneath. Well, the problem with that is that it presumes that no matter what you learn at any step or at any bullet, you're going to just keep following the process. And I think that there needs to be less presumption, and we need to follow a more variety of approaches. So, for instance, if early on you're doing more than just analysis where you look at spend, if you're doing full category analytics where you look at the cost to own, the cost to source, the associated risk, supplier relationships, the contributing value from a customer and shareholder standpoint, it's someplace very early in that sourcing process, there should be a logic gate or a decision point where you've gathered all the information and you say, okay, am I just going to extend the contract? Am I going to hand this off in some form of outsourcing? Am I going to go ahead and strategically source? Am I going to stop buying it? Am I going to roll this into an ongoing contract that I have with some other supplier that has the required qualifications? And that decision point, it's never there. There's never a little process flow where it says, if this, then go left, and if that, then go right. We just march forward, and then we're surprised when, regardless of the inputs, we always get the exact same output at the end of the day, which is more savings and not more value. We're just not allowing enough decision-making and unique perspective into any one of these projects, like Phil said, to get the right value in return for our effort.
So what you're saying is that savings and value aren't necessarily inclusive one with the other. You can get savings, but it may not reflect in the best value. I mean, that's what you're saying, right? Or am I mishearing that?
No, that's
no, I think you're right.
So in essence, with this question, savings and values aren't exactly linked. with the fact that that this question was asked savings and values, does that reflect the fact that, generally speaking, in procurement, we don't recognize, we consider these almost as interchangeable to a certain degree, you know, because it shouldn't be savings and value to a certain degree. It's like, where are the savings and what is the value that those savings produce? I mean, it's almost like a sequential kind of thing rather than a partnered thing, is it not?
It should be, yes. I mean, savings and value is often used interchangeably. It's one of those terms where how do I drive additional value has a different feel to it than how do I drive additional savings. So the value for money equation starts with effective, then goes to efficient, then looks at economic. So that is, what's the outcome, what's the balance of inputs and outputs, and what's the lowest possible input. And what we've got here is a question that looks about additional savings being the lowest input and the greatest effectiveness. So it's just making sure they do link, but it's in the wrong order at the current.
Okay. All right.
So how do we generate the greatest value?
Let's go on to the next question, because you know what, I could spend like 20 minutes on each of these ones, and we've got 10 to go through, so I've got to try to keep pace within the hour. Question number 3. By the way, the key takeaway from that is savings and values are not is not one and the same. It's not the question of you say tomato, I say tomato. They're two different things. Question 3. What are the key analytics that can increase my view of compliance to enhance savings and mitigate business risk? Okay. You know what? I'll start with you, Kelly, and then go to Phil. But when I see this, what's interesting is mitigate business risk, which is an interesting element to this. But there's that word savings coming up again. We're seeing it over and over and over again. So you know, there's encouragement that beyond saving, it's almost like, you know, you can't steal second base with your foot still on first kind of scenario. Right. We still have to have the touchstone of savings, but now we're stretching this question out a little bit more and saying business risk, which is an area that everyone talks about, but very few people do. What are your thoughts relative to these analytics? Like, how can they increase compliance and mitigate business risk?
So I think the thing that's interesting about this, and again, this is contrasting sort of the legacy procurement view of compliance with maybe a more expanded, nuanced view that we're taking once we roll in analytics. I mean, traditionally, we look at, let's say, non-compliance, because it's usually what we're talking about. Nobody talks about compliance and then walks around sharing, you know, hooray for everybody, you all bought off the right contract. It's more the non-compliance. We focus on the exceptions. And even though traditionally we view all non-compliance as bad, it's outside the channel, it's not the right route, it's the wrong supplier, it's the wrong terms, or outside of a contract, not all non-compliance is equally risky. And I think when we start talking about understanding full business risk, right, we're not just talking about risk associated with spend. We're actually talking about risk to the enterprise. It once again requires procurement to take in more varied types of data in order to support the decision. Because if we limit our management and understanding of compliance to what we can learn by looking at historical spend data only, it's simply this behavioral thing. It's black and white. You either did the right thing or you didn't. Now, in some cases, it could be that your company has an office supply contract with Staples and somebody took their P card and went down the street and bought something at Office Depot and, you know, oh, heaven forfend, you know, the sky's falling. Not really a lot of corporate risk there. If, on the other hand, there's a supplier that has not been properly vetted, that has some kind of problematic branding or reputational or regulatory concerns coming along with them, well, that non-compliance, now you're exposing the company to real risk. The same thing might exist if you're working with a service provider. As more and more spend takes a full service or an as-a-service type of form, we have more and more things being done by non-traditional workers. And as a company, you are, to a certain extent, responsible for everything done by each of those people, even if they are not full employees of the company. So again, from my perspective, it's moving beyond the analysis, and it's looking at spend that is not currently on contract, but then also looking at the different types of risks that are associated with the parts of the world and the supply chains and the suppliers themselves and the actions taken by these these entities, whether companies or individuals.
Okay, so I have to ask this, Phil. I'm going to put a little spin on this as I hand this one back over to you. Is it possible that a blind adherence to compliance could actually have a negative impact on savings?
Yes. And so when I look at this, I think around any form of risk is like a balloon, and if you tighten up a particular element of it, and in procurement and adherence to the financial imperative to get the cost aspect of it and the compliance with that particular thing, the risk balloons out in a different area. So that's where an understanding of what the business risk, what the financial risk, and the rest. But there was just a bit that I was writing down here, like anti-money laundering, know your customer, supply chain, all that sort of stuff. You do really, that's where you're opening yourself up to risk on if you do not comply. But if you continue to comply, if you look at Carillion, I'm not entirely sure whether that made the news over in the US, but it was a huge corporate failure that happened in January this year in the UK. I would imagine that it was a failure because of poor commercial strategy and poor contract management. And procurement is at the heart of both of those. I would imagine that they complied with their policies on that. They lowballed stuff because they thought they could offset that in their procurement and their supply chain. I'm sure that they actually complied with all of their policies, all of the aspects around it, and it was a huge corporate failure, destruction of value that is just immense. It was one of the 28 key suppliers to government, got nearly £1 billion worth, so 1.6 or 1.4 billion dollars worth of business with the government last year alone, and it so it's where is that value destruction happening, and understanding what you are doing by blindly complying with some of the stuff, some of the policies and procedures you have.
So in the end, before we move on to the next question, it's safe to say that compliance doesn't always mean savings, nor does it mean a lesser risk. And sometimes compliance may mean greater savings if it makes more sense to and you know, this goes back to the old days of maverick spend. I mean, whenever I talk to buyers who bought off contract, and you know, we saw it a lot in the automotive industry here in North America. PDDA Association, Power Transmission Association, had something like in the U.S. 39% of all purchasing in that area were off contract. In Canada, in the same association, they had 72% off contract. So, you know, if they had complied, they wouldn't have necessarily been able to achieve the results they were going for. So, I mean, the end result here is number one, much like the previous question, you can't assume that savings and mitigation of business risk and clients all go together. And maybe that goes to the first question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have information now, we just have to know how to read it, analyze it, and apply it in a meaningful way. I mean, is that a good way to sort of close this one off?
Well, sort of, John. What I was saying is you've got to understand what you're complying with and understand why the compliance is there. And is the structure that you're complying with still relevant, or have things moved?
Got it. Kelly,
so blind adherence to compliance.
Anything to add on to that?
No, and as a matter of fact, I actually think it's interesting. Based on what Phil's saying, he's actually, I know I'm cheating here because I have the list of questions, but we're starting to talk about effectiveness, which is our next question, right? It's the difference between just doing what you were already going to do, but doing it a little bit faster with less effort, which is efficiency, and being effective where you're going through the prescribed motions, but you're achieving what you were hoping to accomplish when you set out. And I think that's one of those things that is very hard to systematize. So like Phil is saying, Carillion is a great example because, you know, let's say 90% of the people that were leveraging those contracts were doing precisely what they were expected to do, and yet it had a disastrous outcome. It's important that we all not just follow the steps, that we think about what evidence am I seeing, what results can I measure, Are there warning signs? In order to measure effectiveness, just like going from analysis to analytics requires a broadening of your perspective and data inputs, going from efficiency to effectiveness requires you to take in, environmental considerations and things that you observe, and it requires somebody to be really thinking through, yes, this is what the contract says, but I'm sitting in this facility, whether it's a hospital or a school or a prison, all the different kinds of institutions that Carillion was involved with, and I'm seeing signs that there are cracks in the foundation of this entire service agreement. I think that's the challenge when we start trying to apply quantitative measures and metrics to something like effectiveness. It's a big challenge.
Okay, so Phil, given your background and posing this question to you, isn't that more of a cultural element within an organization than one of technology or data or information? I mean, it's almost like, and Kelly, what you're saying is did they notice it, number one, but even if they did notice there were problems, were there the mechanisms in place that they could actually do something with it? I mean, isn't that more cultural, Phil, than anything else?
Well, in a way, yes, definitely. Well, obviously, yes, it is, and it was cultural all the way through. My point in many of these things are that as you get more data, more information, the flow comes through, you can ask better questions. So where you are looking previously, process efficiency, how quickly can we do stuff, what's the turnaround, all that sort of stuff, is easy to measure. Process effectiveness is more difficult to measure, but as you get more information, and this is where the big data aspect comes in, you get more sources, structured, unstructured, formal, informal, you can bring it together. You've got a better understanding of, am I making a positive impact? Not am I making a quick impact, but is what I'm doing adding value or destroying value to the organization? So actually, the answer to question 4 is yes, and that's it. Yes, we do need to. It is a cultural thing, but the availability of through big data, through the new tools, through new techniques, enables effectiveness to be measured better. I was going to say effectiveness measured more effectively, which is what it is about. But yeah, we should be moving from being able to just measure and manage the stuff that's easy to measure to things that are more complex, and effectiveness is more complex.
All right, let's move on to number 5, keep things going. What are the KPIs that we should track for better procurement performance? And, this time I'll start with you, Phil, and then go to Kelly. But one of the things when I first saw this question is that, what are the KPIs we should track for better? How does that change? Like the KPIs, how does the advent of the new technology, the accessibility of the information we need that is now on real time rather than post time, for lack of a better term, I mean, how does that change the KPIs?
The real-time nature of it. Now, so it comes down to quality again. Quality, capability, supply viability. We should be looking at these sorts of things. Should we? Obviously, there's a degree of segmentation required in here, because if you've got a paper supply, it doesn't really matter whether they are viable or not. So how easy it is to swap out, swap in, all that sort of stuff should be borne in mind. And some of the KPIs are probably quite similar to how they've always been. If you're buying chairs, you want the best price. If you're buying land, you need the best price. If you're buying a complex service with outcomes over a period of time, you need to ensure that you've got the right cultural approach, fit, so the supply is viable, that the understanding's there, you're using the right tools, templates, the terms and conditions are appropriate. So they're the sort of, it's almost like a next generation KPI, but it needs to fit what you're trying to do and what decisions you're driving, rather than just saying it all has to be much more complex, because some of the products and services you're buying are simple, have simple KPIs. But as Kelly was saying, if you prisons and the design, build, operate of some of the large institutions is much more complex than just getting the best price.
All right, so Kelly, let me turn this to you and extend just what Phil said in relation to the question. How about this? I rephrase it in, are there new KPIs that didn't previously exist in the procurement world, that the technological advancement in data and accessibility to all this information has created that we didn't know about before?
So I think that access to data makes it possible for us to have a new class of KPIs, but I don't necessarily know that the availability of that data is what's driving it. I actually think, so when you talk about traditional KPIs, it's savings, spend under management, cost avoidance, right? They're all predicated on the fact that the most valuable, scarce resource in the company is money, right? If we're trying to maximize savings, minimize spend, all of that, you're putting money, cash above everything else. I think things have changed, both because procurement has done a good job driving those savings, but also because the way things are economically today, the majority of large public sector companies have abundant, fast access to cash. So the basic premise doesn't necessarily hold true the way that it used to. I would actually argue that the new scarce resource is time. And so more and more of procurement's KPIs should be time-driven. I think there's a number of ways to look at that. We've already talked about having the difference between having access to real-time data and making real-time decisions. So in that case, you would have KPIs that measure how quickly can we go from the identification of the need to being able to satisfy that need through a vetted supply partner. But I think another way of looking at time is that more and more supply chains in an increasing range of industries are now waiting as long as humanly possible to make decisions. And it's, in those cases, it's not because they're afraid to respond to data. It's because they are highly sensitive to consumer signals and they're trying to be very responsive. And so maybe there are cases where procurement gets the opportunity to create value by putting a supply chain in place that allows us to still fulfill demand while delaying specific decisions as long as humanly possible and yet getting everything there on time. I would argue that measurements of time should be the new class of procurement KPI, because maybe like funds were in the early days of strategic formalized procurement, I think time today is the scarce strategic resource that we need to be working to protect and optimize.
That sort of aligns with the sentiments out there. Sorry, Phil, but it aligns with the sentiments out there is that greater requirements and demands are being put on fewer resources, so there's fewer people there, and that goes to what you're saying is that if you have a time KPI there, that's another form of measurement. So Phil, you want to add something, then I just want to add something after you do. What do you have to say?
It is a really quick one. I don't have an answer to this, but one of the things that really strikes an organization and the value of an organization these days is reputation. So how do you ensure that your procurement decisions enhance the reputation, or at least defend the reputation of an organization? So you look at, say, Facebook over the last few days, and the value has dropped because of the perception, obviously because of data breaches and all that sort of stuff, but it's the perception, it's the reputation. So what we need to ensure is that somehow in there, reputation management is measured as a KPI within procurement.
I think that's a great point, and I think it should extend, and that's a perfect sort of movement in where I was going is, you look at reputation measurement. What about KPIs? And you may say this is under the risk management category, but what about, shouldn't it be extended to supplier liquidity to a certain degree? And I'm not talking about doing the background risk management search. I'm talking about timely payments. I'm talking about all the facets that implement or negatively impact the supply side. Because traditionally in the procurement world, and, Kelly, Kate Potasic, obviously, and you know her story of her days at Microsoft, right, where they were rewarded for getting the best deal from the supplier, consequences notwithstanding of the negative impact. But do we really measure or quantify supplier liquidity, supplier capability outside of the framework of just risk, but understanding the entire chain as to how that works? Because if there's a breakdown in that chain, that can come back to hurt reputation in other areas. I mean, what do you think about that, Kelly?
Well, and I think even more directly, it's fantastically measurable, right? And the most concrete indicator of how we're doing in that area today is just simply looking at payment terms versus when we actually pay our suppliers. Because in so many cases, you have these very large companies negotiating contracts with and buying products and services from relatively smaller than them suppliers, and then they're pushing out the payment terms as long as they possibly can, effectively forcing those smaller companies to finance their business by extending those payment terms. But then they're turning around to those same suppliers and saying, where's your R&D budget? Why aren't you innovating? Where are you investing in new created value? When the fact of the matter is, if they would just give those suppliers the money that is theirs that they have rightly earned through the transaction, they would have the funds required to innovate on behalf of the company. So it's another one of those examples of looking at, well, yes, we abided by the payment terms stated in the contract, but not thinking about the extended implications of those payment terms. Are we putting our money where our mouth is and ensuring that funds or liquidity is happening in the right way with the right suppliers so that we're actually getting the innovative potential from the suppliers that we want?
So in the end, we have to have KPIs for time, better time management, better time usage, reputation management, which we know has a very significant impact when not properly managed on the bottom line in supplier relations. Let's go on to the next question, question 6. And there we go, we got it. From a procurement standpoint, what is predictive analytics? All right, that's loaded. So Kelly, I'll start with you and then go to Phil.
Okay, so I actually would answer this question in a couple of different ways. And it comes from, we're all trying to stay on top of the latest topics, right? We've thus far been successful in this webinar and falling back on the B word, right, which is blockchain. We haven't gone there. But I think I have to play the tech buzzword game in response to this question in talking a little bit about the difference between machine learning and cognitive computing, because I think both are sort of different answers or different applications to this idea of predictive analytics within procurement. So I think of machine learning as being taking an established pattern or set of constraints or rules and extending historical data forward into the future in accordance with those rules and patterns and trends and constraints. So I think a good example of that is, teaching a computer how to play chess or checkers, right? It's a fixed thing. There's patterns, there's probabilities, right? It's very captured, it's very calculated. We can do that with demand. We already manage seasonality of volumes and costs and things. So that's one way of looking predictively and anticipating something that's going to happen now is or isn't a good time to renegotiate a contract. But the other way of looking at draws in the capabilities of something like cognitive computing, which is a little bit less structured. So now you're talking about having a computer system that can take something like an audio clip or a photograph or a picture, or can go look at patterns in social media data and search out patterns without those rules and constraints, without things being quite so structured. And I think that's the more challenging part for procurement, because something like that sort of an approach is where you get to bring in less structured things like supply chain risk. That's the harder part. We're trying to anticipate the probability that something we could be prepared to respond to might happen so that our plans are appropriately solidified. I think both of those count as predictive analytics. They both require imagination. They both require the right kind of talent to leverage them and apply them effectively. But it sort of gives us a range from the straightforward following the pattern structured scenario to the almost seemingly unpredictable, less structured scenario that more computing power and data can get us.
Now, you see, one of the things as I listen to you, and these are great points, Kelly, and Phil, as I shift the question over to you, as I was saying to Kelly, I thought, does predictive analytics remove the art out of decision making and make it a scalable science. And do you know what I mean by that, Phil? Is that, and going back to an earlier comment a couple of questions ago, you know, what was the decision making? A lot of procurement professionals, there was an art to knowing what was the right deal. How do we follow this? If we're going to do maverick spend, instinctively, because I know the suppliers, I know the regions, or I've been in this for 10, 15 years, does predictive analytics not just give us data and information, but does it create sound decision making, in essence making it scalable rather than just being, you know, I guess the simple analogy I'll use is, you know, my grandfather used to tell us it was going to rain because his right knee had bursitis in it, and whenever it hurt, inevitably it rained all the time. Do you know where I'm going with that, Phil?
Yes, I think, and it's kind of, I know Kelly said she doesn't like left to right chevron boxes, but I've got describe, define, predict, recommend, and that goes across, it can be at multiple levels. It can be across the product and services, understanding the demand, but also going back to the supply chain aspect, the predictive analytics around the supply chain and what if scenario planning, contingency planning, business risk, all that sort of stuff could come through from there, understanding where your weak spots are. They're probably on well articulated within an organization, but how do you know that you've not got somebody in your supply chain that's employing child labor in Bangladesh? So there will be issues around there that predictive analytics, you can look for the patterns, you can apply the understanding, and maybe that's where it comes through. So from a procurement standpoint, what is predictive analytics? Well, it's whatever you want to make it. It's whether you want to make it so that you can assess and respond quickly to the demand within your business, or whether it's actually you want to do proper scenario planning of the viability of your end-to-end ecosystem.
All right. Let's go on to the next one, because we're quickly approaching 12 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions to go through. And I want to get to question number 10. So depending on how long we deal with question number 7, we may just jump to number 10, because I think, Phil, that was an important one. And we certainly will want to end with it, even though we couldn't start with it. Question 7, what new skill sets are required to capitalize on data analytics? And I think we've touched the surface of this question to a certain degree, or at least around the periphery of it. But are there any hard skills, Phil, that we need to have now as procurement professionals?
I don't know whether it's hard skills. Yeah, it's how you define hard skills and soft skills. First off, creativity and thinking laterally. So if you have data analytics, and this is probably where some of my frustration with some of the procurement functions I've seen is it is mono-focused, and that is on the cost of the deal rather than the value of the relationship. So what new skill sets is a business acumen. How does a business run? What's the lifeblood of it, and an understanding of how you can add to that. So there's all sorts of other ones around financial skills, technical skills. If you are building your AI stuff, how do you coaching them, the systems, etc. That essentially, I'm just repeating myself here on a previous question, is understanding the decisions that need to be made and understanding how you get to those.
All right, so Kelly, in taking what Phil said, and I'm going to insert a little bit into this, is that I remember a CPO agenda roundtable discussion, and the outcome of that, one of it was saying that these CPOs and executives were saying, give me one strategic buyer or procurement person over 10 regular buyers. And you know where that leads into, obviously, in terms of this question. I mean, when you're talking about being strategic, maybe back then, I'm not sure if strategic was certainly with the analytics and big data and the technologies, I'm not sure that strategic necessarily means the same thing back then as it does now. But is it more easy, or is it easier to be strategic now?
I think the challenge remains, and it's funny because I 100% agree with Phil's sort of initial response to this question around imagination, sort of artistic, creative thinking. But I think from a procurement perspective, there's a second piece to it, and that is that we walk into a situation, and I think super overgeneralizing, where a group of people that want order and want structure. And that's why we've so comfortably taken to all of these process flows and structured task lists. But in some cases, the way to derive sustained value is to come in and recognize order in an unstructured data environment without attempting to superimpose a hard-coded structure that's going to limit the value you get out of it in the long run. So we need to do a better job of coming to things with artistic thought, but then not driving all of the value out of something by saying, well, there are no walls here. Clearly this place needs walls. We're going to build structure. We're going to put very firm breaks and lines in place. To Phil's point about being able to think laterally, we need to not contain our approach to spend management or risk assessment or supplier relationships to single category silos or traditional industry views. We need to be able to think and create order, right, so that we can bring things under management, but not put so much structure in place that it creates walls that block out opportunity.
All right. Now, you know what? We're coming to the end. Question 8 is, how does this change my relationship with finance? Question 9, if we can get to these, in what way can analytics help to better manage risk? I think we've touched on that a little bit. Let's go to question 10. If we have time, we'll revert back to those other ones. Phil, and this is your favorite. I'm going to call it your favorite. I've been hearing about big data for the last few years, but little has really changed. What is different now and why? So here, this was the one we're supposed to start with. Take it away, Phil.
Well, yeah, it was just that it just had a really good way of breaking into what are we talking about. But, you know, it comes down to the fact that, for a start, storage is much cheaper, much more readily available. It's there. We have that. We've got data. We're producing so much data at the moment. And one of the fears on the big data questions, one of the fears on all of this is getting swamped by it. So that comes back down to the decision one. But we've got the storage, we've got the data, processing power. So what used to take a week to train AI on, you can run overnight, we can run in the hour or whatever. And that's what it's required, is the speed, it's the power, it's the availability there. Connectivity, so much more is connected. So that enables greater linkages. And the generation of algorithms and, you know, being able to get in there and drive that through. So it kind of, we're also subtly shifted in how we respond to some of these technologies as well. So we use this on a day-by-day basis with the Ubers, with the Alexas, with voice recognition. And it's the application of what we're comfortable with anyway into an enterprise situation. So big data has been heralded for a number of years, but we're actually now at a point where people are comfortable with it. They've got the processing power, we've got the connectivity, we've got a greater understanding and of the algorithms that are required. So that's what's different from my perspective. That and the tools are much more readily available as well.
So Kelly, what's happened is that we've always had this sea of information we needed, but sifting through it to get to meaningful data in a real-time basis that can then drive or help our organizations to derive greater benefits is just now emerging because of the technological breakthrough. And Phil was talking about that capability. Is technological breakthrough, is that the only factor that is changed relative to the advantages or potential big data has to offer?
Well, I think it's a critical breakthrough because the effect that it's had is that it has made the application of big data. I mean, big data is important, right? But it has no value in and of itself. It's only in application that it has value. And the fact that the technology has advanced to the point that it's much cheaper to work with it, it has allowed the application of big data to be consumerized. And so we're not always aware of it, certainly, but most of us interact with big data or its implications a million tiny little different ways over the course of the day, and we don't really think about it. But we're getting more and more comfortable with it, and it exists in the back of our mind. We know that we're the beneficiary of, for instance, crowdsourced traffic data that comes to us through an app on our smartphone while we're driving from point A to point B. We know that that mining is going on, the connectivity, the computer processing on an individual level is coming through to us. And so it changes, for those of us that don't have a background in this, it changes how we think about being able to apply it in an enterprise context. And being able to conceive of, okay, you know what, the whole big data thing, the storage, the cleansing, the security, all of that is a little bit beyond me, but I have a tech partner and their value proposition is that they will handle all that. So I'm not going to concern myself a ton with that piece of it. Instead, it's incumbent upon me to come up with the most valuable way to leverage the insights and the analytics that I can do using that data. And I think that's where the technological advancements, making everything less expensive, making it more applicable, it's one of those things. I actually think it's more creeping from a consumer to an enterprise place than vice versa. And to me, that's the big difference in terms of big data.
Okay, and one of the things that come to me is, and let me just quickly ask this, and I know a yes and no question is certainly not sufficient, but I can't help also thinking that our experiences, as we have more generational influx into the procurement realms, younger people who are more comfortable with the technologies, I mean, I can't help but feel that that has a certain degree of influence over it as well. I mean, because look what we're doing now with wearable devices, mobile devices, handheld, everything like that. I mean, you know, if you look, and you have children, and I have children, Phil, I imagine you do as well. I mean, you know, we have 5, 6, 7-year-olds who type at a mile a second in terms of using the iPhone. So I would imagine that that would help to also create a level of comfort as we begin to see more and more millennials coming into the workforce and coming into the procurement realms. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yes. The digitally excluded when we look at this is often it's not associated aspect, it's an age demography, and what we find in large corporations is the top of the shop really want to try new things out, and then the people, early career people, are just, why would you do it any other differently? And it's sort of a middle permafrost layer that you have to break through. So you didn't want a yes or no answer, but yes is my answer.
Right. Well, you know what, and Kelly, you have to have a yes or no because we have about 30 seconds left now.
Oh, then my answer is absolutely yes. The changing workforce expectations are absolutely going to drive even greater use of technology and big data.
All right. Well, everybody, Sabra, before I turn over to you in a few seconds, I just want to remind everybody that a lot of the highlights from this discussion will be made available using the hashtag BGDataAsk on Twitter. Over the coming days, and certainly we encourage you to add any thoughts or opinions that you have relative to this as well. Kelly and Phil, you know, great to share this time with you. As they always say, good discussion, time flies, and that certainly did today. Sabra, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so do you have any questions? This is to the further audience. If you have any questions, we can just wait a few seconds. You can just use the Q&A widget there on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just tap in there, and our expert speakers can answer them.
I think at this point,
okay.
Kelly and Phil, we could sort of cue the Jeopardy music, right? You get Jeopardy in the UK, don't you?
Not entirely sure.
Oh, okay.
It's probably called something else. Yeah.
Kelly, you know what I'm talking about, though, right?
I do, but I'm not going to sing.
So great. We don't have any questions right now. So thanks, John, Kelly, and Phil, for sharing your insight. It was a great knowledge packed session. With that, we would like to end our session for today. Thank you for joining us. Have a nice day. Thank you.